For decades, the U.S. auto industry stood as a pillar of American manufacturing strength, a symbol of industrial power from Detroit to Ohio. Asian automakers like Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, Kia, and Nissan invested billions into American plants, hiring tens of thousands of workers and turning rusting factory towns into booming industrial hubs. But as 2025 unfolds, the story is taking a dramatic turn. 5 major Asian automakers have announced plans to shut down or scale back their U.S. operations, triggering the loss of over 38,000 jobs and sparking fears of a manufacturing exodus unlike anything America has seen in decades. The crisis has deep roots. When the Trump administration launched its aggressive tariff policies, the goal was clear: bring manufacturing back to the U.S. by punishing imports and forcing companies to buy American. Steel, aluminum, car parts, tariffs hit everything. At first, it seemed to work politically. There were speeches promising jobs, headlines about economic nationalism, and bold claims that tariffs would restore U.S. manufacturing to its former glory. But reality turned out far messier. Asian automakers relied on complex global supply chains. A car built in Alabama or Michigan often contains engines from Japan, electronics from South Korea, steel from Brazil, and semiconductors from Taiwan. By slapping tariffs on raw materials and imported components, Washington inadvertently raised production costs on U.S. soil. Building a car in America suddenly became more expensive than building the same car in Mexico, Canada, or Southeast Asia, and shipping it to Europe or Latin America. By mid-2024, auto executives were quietly warning that U.S. operations were turning unprofitable. A Toyota executive reportedly told investors that tariffs added $12,500 to the cost of every car assembled in Kentucky. Nissan's Tennessee plant faced similar numbers, while Hyundai and Kia in Georgia saw rising costs for imported batteries and chips needed for electric vehicle production. What was supposed to protect American jobs was now eroding profit margins and pushing companies toward tough choices. The breaking point came when consumer demand began to slide. Inflation, driven in part by higher production costs, pushed car prices beyond the reach of many middle-class buyers. Dealerships from Michigan to Texas reported declining sales. Plants slowed production schedules. Workers were furloughed. And then, in early 2025, the bombshell announcements landed. Toyota would shift part of its U.S. production to Mexico and Japan. Honda planned to close an Ohio plant entirely, cutting thousands of jobs. Hyundai and Kia announced joint plans to move EV production to South Korea, citing tariff pressures. Nissan confirmed it would downsize U.S. operations and expand in Southeast Asia instead. Combined, the moves meant 38,000 direct job losses and untold ripple effects through suppliers, logistics firms, and local economies. For Detroit, once the beating heart of the American auto sector, this felt like a second industrial collapse. The first was decades ago when U.S. automakers like GM and Chrysler shuttered plants during globalization's first wave. Now, the very foreign companies that once revived American factory towns were packing up and leaving, blaming the very policies designed to protect them. The announcements shook Wall Street, rattled unions, and ignited a political firestorm. Was this the inevitable result of economic nationalism colliding with global reality? Or had Washington miscalculated, triggering a corporate retreat that could cripple the U.S. auto sector for years? As the announcements rippled through the auto sector, the economic fallout began almost immediately. Local economies that had grown dependent on Asian automakers for decades faced a sudden and painful shock. In Ohio alone, the closure of Honda's plant meant not only thousands of lost jobs, but also a devastating hit to suppliers who provided everything from seat fabrics to engine components. Economists warned that for every direct factory job lost, 3 to 5 additional jobs in the local economy could disappear as well, from truck drivers and parts manufacturers to the diners and small businesses serving plant workers. In Detroit, Once the proud Motor City, the news hit especially hard. For years, Asian automakers had stepped in where American giants retreated, reopening old plants and restoring hope to cities hollowed out by globalization. Now, with production shifting overseas, many residents felt a sense of betrayal. Union leaders called it a manufacturing betrayal and staged protests outside shuttered facilities, demanding government intervention and accusing policymakers of driving away investment with reckless trade wars. Politically, the blame game erupted instantly. Supporters of Trump's tariffs insisted the companies were using the trade war as an excuse to offshore jobs they had always intended to move. Critics countered that the administration had failed to understand modern supply chains, where tariffs on raw materials and components made U.S.-based production far less competitive. Senators from affected states demanded emergency relief packages, tax incentives, and even tariff rollbacks to keep the remaining factories open. Meanwhile, financial markets reacted with unease. Shares of Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai rose as investors welcomed cost-cutting moves abroad, but U.S. auto suppliers saw stocks tumble amid fears of shrinking orders. Analysts predicted that some American parts manufacturers could face bankruptcy if production didn't return quickly. The auto industry, long seen as a bellwether for the broader economy, was flashing warning signs of deeper trouble ahead. Internationally, competitors sensed opportunity. Mexico offered generous tax incentives for automakers relocating south of the border, while Vietnam and Thailand pitched themselves as new hubs for electric vehicle production. South Korea, already home to Hyundai and Kia, launched a $5 billion package to expand domestic EV manufacturing, explicitly targeting production capacity leaving the United States. For Washington, the situation posed a difficult dilemma. Rolling back tariffs risked political backlash from voters who supported America First policies. But keeping them risked accelerating the corporate retreat and deepening job losses in critical swing states. Economists warned that without quick action, the U.S. could face a permanent loss of manufacturing capacity, the kind of decline that takes decades to reverse, if it can be reversed at all. By mid-2025, it was clear that the automaker's departure was no temporary maneuver. It marked the beginning of a larger realignment in global manufacturing, one that could leave the United States on the sidelines of the very industry it once dominated. By late 2025, the shockwaves from the Asian automakers' exodus were being felt far beyond Detroit or Ohio. Economists described it as a manufacturing tipping point, a moment when decades of global integration collided with the realities of protectionist policies and rising costs. For the U.S., once the undisputed leader in automotive innovation, the departure of 5 major Asian automakers threatened not only immediate job losses, but the long-term competitiveness of an entire sector. The electric vehicle, EV revolution, added another layer of complexity. As the world races toward a future dominated by battery-powered cars, countries across Europe and Asia are pouring billions into EV infrastructure, research, and supply chains. South Korea is building massive battery plants. China already controls most of the world's lithium and rare earth processing, and Europe is investing heavily in green mobility technology. With Asian automakers now shifting production and R&D resources back home or to emerging markets, the U.S. risks falling behind in the very technologies shaping the next era of transportation. Policy debates in Washington grew louder. Lawmakers from affected states demanded emergency stimulus packages to rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity. Some pushed for tariff rollbacks to lure companies back, while others doubled down, arguing that America should instead focus on creating its own EV champions rather than relying on foreign firms. But critics pointed out that building an entirely new supply chain from scratch could take years, if not decades, and would require investments far beyond what Congress had so far committed. On the ground, the human toll continued to rise. Towns once revived by Toyota or Hyundai plants faced shrinking tax revenues, school closures, and rising unemployment. Younger workers began migrating to cities or even abroad in search of jobs, leaving aging communities struggling to survive. Economists warned that entire regions risked sliding into permanent economic decline unless new industries replaced the lost manufacturing base. Internationally, the exodus reshaped the global auto landscape. Mexico quickly emerged as a major winner, securing new investments from Toyota, Nissan, and Honda, with plans to export vehicles worldwide from low-cost plants just across the U.S. border. Southeast Asia, too, gained momentum, with Thailand and Vietnam positioning themselves as future EV hubs. The irony was hard to miss. Policies meant to protect U.S. manufacturing had instead fueled the rise of new competitors abroad. As 2025 drew to a close, one question dominated headlines and political debates alike. Could the U.S. auto industry survive without foreign investment, or was this the beginning of a permanent decline? For many workers in Detroit and beyond, the answer seemed grim. Factories once filled with the sounds of roaring engines now stood silent, symbols of a policy gamble whose costs were only beginning to unfold.